You're 45. And somewhere between the mortgage payment that clears automatically every month, the retirement account you check less often than you probably should, the car that's almost paid off, and the kid's college fund you started later than you intended, somewhere in the middle of all of it, a question surfaces that you've been half answering for years. Am I where I'm supposed to be? Not in the vague, motivational sense, in the specific, numerical sense. The sense that requires looking at the actual balance, the actual debt, the actual net worth, and measuring it against something real, rather than against the comfortable estimate you carry around that makes the Sunday nights manageable. The problem is that nobody around you is telling the truth about their numbers. The colleague with the nice car and the renovated kitchen might be leveraged to the point of fragility. The neighbor who seems effortlessly comfortable might be two income disruptions away from a serious problem. The social performance of financial stability in your mid-40s is so complete and so universal that the actual data is nearly impossible to read from the outside. So you're left with your number, whatever it is, and no honest benchmark to measure it against. Today, I'm giving you that benchmark, the real one, with the actual Federal Reserve data, the actual retirement savings figures, and the actual context that makes the number mean something instead of just existing as a source of anxiety or false reassurance. Whatever your number is right now, it is not a verdict. It is a starting point for the most financially consequential decade of your life. My name is William. Let's look at where you actually stand. What the data shows for the average 45-year-old in 2026. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, updated with 2026 market conditions, puts the median net worth for Americans in the 45 to 54 age bracket at approximately $168,000. The mean net worth for the same group is approximately $975,000. The gap between those two numbers tells you everything you need to know about wealth distribution in America. The median, the middle point where half of people have more and half have less, is $168,000. The mean, the average pulled dramatically upward by concentrated wealth at the top, is nearly $1 million. When the mean is nearly 6 times the median is not a useful benchmark for most people's actual situation. The median is your number. $168,000 in net worth at 45. That is the middle of the distribution. That is where statistically average looks like in 2026 for your age group. Now here's what that $168,000 typically looks like in practice, because the composition of net worth at this age matters as much as the total figure. For most households in the 45 to 54 bracket, the largest single component is home equity. The second largest is retirement account balances. Liquid savings outside of retirement accounts, the money actually accessible without penalty, without selling a house, without a tax consequence, typically represents a much smaller portion than the headline number suggests. The average 45-year-old has more net worth than liquid wealth, sometimes significantly more. That distinction matters enormously for financial flexibility, and it's one of the most consistently overlooked aspects of mid-career financial assessment.
Retirement savings, the number that determines everything. If net worth is the broad picture, the retirement account balance is the specific number that determines whether the future you're working toward is actually funded. Fidelity's retirement savings benchmarks recommend having approximately 4 times your annual salary saved for retirement by age 45. On the median household income for this age bracket, approximately $100,000 to $105,000 for this age bracket, that benchmark is $400,000 to $420,000 in retirement savings by 45. The actual median 401k and IRA balance for Americans in the 45 to 54 age bracket, approximately $115,000 to $134,000, depending on the data source. The gap between the recommended benchmark of $400,000 and the actual median of approximately $125,000 is the number most 45-year-olds need to sit with honestly, not with panic, with honesty. Because the gap, while significant, is not irreversible. and the decade between 45 and 55 is arguably the most financially powerful decade available to anyone who uses it correctly. Here is why. At 45, you are typically at or approaching peak earning years. The kids are moving toward independence, and the childcare costs that compress the savings rate in your 30s are reducing or gone. The mortgage is further along, and the equity is building. The career capital accumulated across 20 years of working is at its most monetizable. Every percentage point increase in savings rate applied to a higher income across a 10-year window with significant compounding ahead of it produces outcomes that the early years of your career simply couldn't generate. The decade you're entering is not a recovery period. It is the acceleration period. The question is whether you treat it as one.
What the average 45-year-old actually owns, the complete picture. Assets first. Home equity for homeowners in this bracket averages approximately $150,000 to $200,000, though this varies dramatically by market, purchase date, and remaining mortgage balance. The homeowner who bought in 2019 in a mid-sized market sits in a very different equity position than the one who bought in 2022 at peak prices with a minimal down payment. Retirement accounts at the median, approximately $125,000. Liquid savings outside retirement, the Federal Reserve data suggests the median American in this bracket holds approximately $10,000 to $18,000 in accessible savings, a number that feels thin against the obligations and risks characteristic of the mid-40s life stage. Vehicle equity, typically modest. Most 45-year-olds in the data carry a car loan balance that offsets a significant portion of vehicle value, particularly those who upgraded in the 2021 to 2023 period when new vehicle prices were substantially elevated above historical norms. Liabilities. Mortgage balance averaging approximately $220,000 for homeowners, though this varies significantly by geography and purchase history. Student loan debt still carried by approximately 30% of this age bracket at an average balance of $40,000, a figure that reflects both original borrowing and the compounding of balances that were managed minimally during earlier income-constrained years. Credit card balances averaging approximately $8,000 for those carrying revolving debt. Net the assets against the liabilities and you arrive at the median $168,000. For many households, that figure is dominated by illiquid equity, home equity that requires a sale or a loan to access, retirement savings that require a penalty to touch before 59 and a half. The genuinely liquid financial position of the median 45-year-old is considerably more modest than the net worth figure suggests.
The three traps that define this life stage. At 45, three financial dynamics are operating simultaneously, and understanding them specifically is more useful than any generic advice about saving more and spending less. The first is the peak lifestyle cost compression. Your 40s are simultaneously your highest earning decade and your most expensive lifestyle decade. The mortgage, the remaining years of childcare or education costs, the cars sized for family transportation, the social environment, colleagues, neighbors, school community, whose spending patterns create a visible benchmark calibrated to dual-income professional households at their earning peak. The pressure to spend at the level the income theoretically supports is highest precisely at the moment when the savings rate needs to be at its highest. The second is the retirement math urgency that most people feel, but few act on with the precision the moment requires. At 45, you have approximately 20 years to retirement at 65. $1 invested today at 7% annual returns becomes approximately $3.87 by retirement. At 55, with 10 years remaining, that same $1 becomes $1.97. The investment made in this decade is worth twice what the same investment made in the next decade produces. That is not a motivational claim, it is arithmetic. And it means that every year the savings rate stays below its potential in this decade costs more than the equivalent year at any other point in the career. The third is the sequence of returns exposure that arrives with this level of accumulated retirement savings.
At $125,000 invested, a 30% market correction costs approximately $37,500, painful but recoverable with 20 years of contributions ahead. At $500,000, where this bracket should be by the benchmark, the same correction costs $150,000. The risk profile of retirement savings changes as the balance grows, and the investment allocation that was appropriate at 35 may not be appropriate at 45. Not because the market is more dangerous, but because the absolute dollar value of downside exposure has grown relative to the recovery runway.
The income picture. What the average 45-year-old is actually earning. Median household income for the 45 to 54 bracket in 2026, approximately $100,000 to $108,000. Individual median earnings for full-time workers in this group, approximately $65,000 to $75,000. Peak earnings for most professional tracks arrive between 45 and 55, which means if you're going to close the gap between your current retirement balance and the Fidelity benchmark, this is the decade where the income exists to do it. The salary is higher than it's ever been. The fixed costs are beginning to reduce as children age out of their most expensive years. The structural conditions for an accelerated savings rate are as favorable as they will ever be. What typically prevents the acceleration is a lifestyle that's scaled up with income across the entire career and now represents fixed commitments that resist reduction. The apartment that became the house that became the bigger house, the cars sized for peak income, the private school tuition that started as a choice and became a social expectation. The lifestyle architecture of the average 45-year-old household was built for spending the income, not for building beyond it.
What to do with this information, specifically and immediately? 4 moves in order of impact. First, calculate your actual retirement savings rate today as a percentage of gross income. The target for someone at 45 with a significant gap between current savings and the Fidelity benchmark is 20 to 25% of gross, not the default 6% most people set during enrollment and never revisited. The 401k contribution limit in 2026 is $23,500. If you're 50 or older, the catch-up contribution adds $7,500, bringing the limit to $31,000. If you're not maximizing or approaching the maximum, identify what it would take to get there and what spending category funds the increase. Second, run the Social Security estimate at ssa.gov for your specific earnings record. At 45, you have enough contribution history to see a meaningful projection. That projection, combined with your current retirement account balance, tells you the real gap between where you're heading and where you need to be. Most people have never run this calculation with their actual numbers. Most people who run it for the first time find the result clarifying in a way that no generic advice about saving more produces. Third, examine your fixed cost structure as a percentage of take-home income. Total fixed monthly obligations, mortgage, car payments, insurance, loan minimums, subscriptions, divided by monthly take-home. If that ratio exceeds 60%, the margin available for savings acceleration is structurally insufficient regardless of income. The problem isn't the savings rate, it's the fixed cost architecture consuming the margin before savings gets a claim on it. Fourth, if you have adult children approaching college age and college funding competing with retirement funding for the same dollars, fund retirement first. Your children can borrow for college, you cannot borrow for retirement. The financial content industry treats this as a controversial position. The mathematics treat it as a straightforward one. The benchmark is $168,000 in median net worth. The retirement recommendation is $400,000 in savings. Most 45-year-olds are somewhere between those two realities, above the median net worth, below the retirement benchmark, with a decade ahead of them that is more financially powerful than any they've experienced. The gap is real. The decade ahead is real.
The compounding available in that decade, applied to an accelerated savings rate at peak earnings, is real in a way that makes the gap closable for most people who decide this year, not next year, this year, that the acceleration begins now. You asked where you stand. Now you know. The more important question is what you do about it before the most financially powerful decade of your life becomes the decade you almost used correctly. The most powerful financial decade of your life is the one you're in right now. The only question is whether you use it. Subscribe for a new video every week and drop your honest retirement savings number in the comments. No judgment, just the data that helps everyone calibrate.